Hey guys, welcome to the Airy Side Podcast with your hosts, Sophia.
Dee and Elena.
We appreciate you guys listening, and I hope you're ready to get on the airy side. Before we get into the show, we would appreciate it if you all could give the podcast a follow and make sure that bell notification is turned on so you'll be notified whenever we drop an episode. If you enjoy the show, we would love to have you leave us a review, and if there's a case suggestion or any feedback you'd like to share, please feel free to send us a message in the text box below. Share the podcast with family, friends, coworkers, or really anyone you think will enjoy the podcast. And lastly, if you are on social media, please follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Before we begin, please be aware that this episode contains detailed discussions about disturbing and tragic events involving torture, sexual assault, and murder. We understand the subject matter may be deeply unsettling or distressing for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. If you feel this content may be too difficult for you, we encourage you to consider whether you want to proceed with listening. Please take care of yourself and know that support resources are available if you need them. All right, everyone. The case I'm doing today takes place in Philadelphia. I wanted to do a Pennsylvania case because we actually have a lot of listeners in Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia. So this is one for all of you Pennsylvania and Philly listeners. The case is about Gary Heidnik. Do either of you two know him?
No.
Something sounds familiar, but I don't have a clear picture.
It's a very brutal one. In this story, Gary is not the good guy. He ends up doing a lot of terrible things to women, which is not surprising given what he experiences in his childhood. Not to excuse it, but when we look at some of these monsters, oftentimes they've had traumatic childhoods, and Gary definitely fits into this. Gary Heidnik was born on November 22nd, 1943, in East Lake, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. His parents were Michael and Ellen Heidnik, and he had a younger brother, Terry. After their parents divorced in 1946, Gary and his brother were raised by their mother for 4 years before being placed in the care of their dad and his new wife. Gary would later claim that he was emotionally abused by his father. He struggled with a lifelong problem of bedwetting and said that his father would humiliate him by forcing him to hang his stained sheets from his bedroom window in full view of the neighbors. However, this is something that his father would later deny. At school, Gary did not interact with other students and he refused to make eye contact. An example of Gary being antisocial is when one time a well-meaning new girl student asked him, "Did you get the homework done, Gary?" He yelled at her and told her she was not worthy enough to talk to him. Gary was also teased about his oddly shaped head, which he and Terry claimed was the result of him falling out of a tree when he was younger. Looking at pictures of him, I have a hard time seeing his head as being unusually shaped, but maybe it was more noticeable when he was younger. Nonetheless, Gary performed well academically and tested with an IQ of 148. With his father's encouragement, when Gary was 14 years old, he enrolled at the Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia for 2 years, and he left right before graduation. At some point, he ended up back in public school, after which he dropped out and joined the United States Army when he was 17. Gary's military service ended up lasting 13 months. During basic training, his drill sergeant graded him as excellent. He applied for several specialist positions, including the military police, but was rejected. He was assigned to San Antonio, Texas, to be trained as a medic and did well through medical training. However, Gary did not stay in San Antonio for long and was transferred to the 46th Army Surgical Hospital in Landstuhl, West Germany. Within weeks of his new posting, he earned his GED. In August 1962, Gary began complaining of severe headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, and nausea. A hospital neurologist diagnosed Gary with gastroenteritis and noted that he also displayed symptoms of mental illness for which he was prescribed trifluoperazine. In October 1962, Gary was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and then was honorably discharged from military service. I'm not a psychologist, but according to Mayo Clinic, schizoid personality disorder is, quote, a condition where a person shows very little, if any, interest and ability to form relationships with other people. It's very hard for the person to express a full range of emotions. If you have schizoid personality disorder, you may be seen as keeping to yourself or rejecting others. You may not be interested in or able to form close friendships or romantic relationships. Because you do not tend to show emotion, it may appear that you do not care about others or what's going on around you.
It's actually really interesting that you're doing a case about that because I'm in a class that's actually right now and I'm learning about that.
Schizoid personality disorder?
Well, it's one of the disorders that I'm learning about, yeah.
That's so interesting because sometimes I will randomly go and read them and it's hard to understand what kind of person that you know actually fits into this. But knowing Gary, knowing how he treated people, at least, like, for example, that one girl who he completely shut down, he fits right into this.
When the military honorably discharged Gary, did they also release him from the medical hospital, or was he still in there?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I'm not sure, but I do know that Gary spent his adulthood in and out of psychiatric hospitals. So potentially he was still in a psychiatric hospital.
Okay, I was just wondering if the government just decided goodbye, go on the streets, you're not part of the military, and let him be or not.
He was transferred to the military hospital and then he was diagnosed with it and then he was discharged. But after they discharged, I'm not sure if he had to leave because he was in a military hospital or if they sent him to another hospital. I'm not sure. But he was in and out of hospitals quite frequently, so.
Okay.
Shortly after his discharge, Gary became a licensed practical nurse and enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, but dropped out after one semester. He then worked at a Veterans Administration hospital in Coatesville, but was fired for poor attendance and rude behavior towards patients. In terms of his mental health, like I mentioned, Gary spent his adulthood in and out of psychiatric hospitals and had attempted suicide at least 13 times. Unfortunately, his family struggled with their own mental health too. In 1970, his mother, who had been diagnosed with bone cancer and was struggling with alcoholism, took her own life by drinking mercuric chloride. His brother, Terry, also spent time in mental institutions and attempted suicide multiple times. In October 1971, Gary started a church called the United Church of the Ministers of God, and it initially only had 5 followers. Then, in 1975, he opened an account under the church's name with Merrill Lynch.
Wait, just to double check, you said he started his own church?
Yep.
Okay, interesting.
I know this is taking an interesting turn. The initial deposit that he put in his account in Merrill Lynch was for $1,500, and Gary eventually acquired over $500,000, which in today's money in 2025 would be $2.9 million. So Gary's doing pretty well.
Where did he get the money? I missed that.
I didn't say, but essentially just by growing the church is how he managed.
Oh, I thought maybe he got some loan or something.
The only thing I have is that he successfully amassed $550,000 through his brokerage account. He was an investor. I believe he got that through investing. Later on, somebody who was familiar with his finances mentioned that he was an astute investor. So I think it probably came from investing. And as he continued the church, I'm wondering if maybe some of it came from church donations as well, but I'm not entirely sure. By 1986, the United Church of the Ministers of God was doing very well financially. So let's go back a little bit. I told you that he started the church in 1971, and 15 years later, in 1986, it was doing very well. But after he started the church, 5 years after, in 1976, Gary was charged with aggravated assault and for carrying an unlicensed pistol after shooting at the tenant of a house he offered for rent. The bullet ended up grazing the man's face. Now, when it came to his love life and dreams for the future, Gary wanted to have a big family. In the 1970s, he dated a woman named Gail Linco. After dating for a while, the two gave birth to a son named Gary Jr. But shortly after his birth, he was put into foster care. The reason he was put into foster care was because Gail was mentally disabled. In the late 1970s, Gary got involved in a relationship with Anjanette Davidson. Anjanette was illiterate and also had a mental disability, just like Gail. So Anjanette ended up giving birth to a daughter named Maxine on March 16, 1978. However, just like his first child, Maxine was placed in foster care in 1978 due to Anjanette's mental disabilities. Okay, around the same time, Gary learned about Anjanette's sister, Alberta Davidson, who also had a mental disability. Alberta was in an institution for the mentally disabled, and so in 1978, Gary decided to abduct Alberta from the institution. He then went and he signed Alberta out of the Harrisburg State Hospital.
Oh, I thought you were saying he like kidnapped her for like
He did.
But wait, but he like still signed her out?
Yes, because he really wasn't supposed to do what he did. I'm just letting you know how the kidnapping went. He wasn't supposed to sign her out. He had no right to do that.
I thought you
Finessed
like broke in and snuck in and like took
That's what
her
I
some-
thought at first, but after I
like,
read into it, it wasn't how it happened. And also, it's also a kidnapping just based on what he does to her right after this. And so he signed her out on day leave, but then he imprisoned her in a locked storage room in his basement. To be honest, I'm not sure if he would have been able to sign her out if he didn't do the following, but regardless, it was a kidnapping because of what happened. Anyways, after Alberta was found and returned to the hospital, an examination revealed that she had been raped and sodomized and that she had contracted gonorrhea as well.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, he's just a beast, honestly.
Okay, we're on number 3 here. And I was wondering if he was arrested at this point and put in jail. He himself has some mental issues. He is finding vulnerable women who have mental issues. He gets to the point that he's kidnapping them and raping them. He has 2 children who are in foster care. No one has arrested him. No one has done anything.
Well, keep in mind, he technically didn't do anything wrong with Anjanette and Gail.
True.
And
There's nothing arrestable.
There is for the last one.
For the last one, of course.
I mean, he has a record of, doing something that isn't healthy for the community. And now he's leveled up to kidnapping and raping. Mm-hmm. So are there any consequences to his actions?
yes, well, for Alberta, because I'm assuming her mental disability was more challenged than her sister's. I'm not entirely sure. She was in the institution, and the fact that he ended up doing all these things to her and it was a rape, I'm assuming there was no way she could consent to anything. Gary was arrested and charged and convicted of kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and interfering with the custody of a committed person. The original sentence was overturned on appeal, and Gary spent 3 years of his incarceration in mental institutions prior to being released in April of 1983 under the supervision of a state-sanctioned mental health program. So, really, it seems like he wasn't supposed to take her out anyways, regardless. And as we'll find out, Alberta had not been mentally fit to take the stand. And because of that, Gary got away with a lighter conviction. After his incarceration, Gary's obsession with having a family only seemed to have gotten stronger. When Gary was released, he tried to locate Anjanette, but was unable to do so. So he resorted to a matrimonial service to find another partner for himself. In 1983, he met a Filipino woman named Betty Disto. Betty was in the Philippines, so for a couple of years, they sent each other letters to get to know each other before Gary eventually proposed to her. Then Betty came to the United States in September 1985, and they tied the knot in Maryland in the following month on October 3rd and were legally married. However, this marriage did not last long because Betty ended up catching Gary in bed with 3 other women.
Wait, like 3 all at once?
Yes, 3 all at once.
Oh my God.
And it gets even worse because supposedly he would even force Betty to be an onlooker while he had sex with these other women right in front of her.
Ew.
Yeah.
He's just a man.
So gross. Betty would also accuse Gary of raping and assaulting her. And so with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia, she was able to leave Gary in January 1986. Gary was eventually arrested again and charged with assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. Then in 1987, and by that time, Gary and Betty had already gotten divorced, Betty requested child support payments from Gary, which is how he learned that on September 15, 1986, she had given birth to a son whom she named Jesse John Desto. So Betty left Gary in January 1986, and later on that year, he would start committing the crimes he is most notorious for to this day.
So these crimes are more notorious than what he's already committed?
Yes, much, much more. In my opinion, he's one of the worst people we've done. So let's get into it. This next part is really brutal and disgusting, so just take care of yourselves. On November 25th, 1986, when Gary was 43 years old, he abducted a 25-year-old woman named Josefina Rivera. Josefina had gotten into drugs at an early age, and by 25, she was working as a prostitute in downtown Philadelphia to maintain her habit. Josefina was picked up by Gary, who convinced her to go back to his house. After they had sex, he choked her from behind, put her in handcuffs, and led her downstairs, naked, to his run-down basement cellar, and she was tied to a radiator in what was described as a cold, dark hole in the ground. The first few days of her captivity, Gary beat her, and Josefina thought eventually he would kill her. But after those first few days, Gary told her the real reason he brought her down there. He said, "I want to have kids, lots of them. I got kids already, but the state keeps taking them off of me. Well, I got a way now of having kids, so nobody can take them away. You're just the star. You're going to have my babies down here, but not just you. I want to get 10 girls down here so you can all have my kids."
Oh my God.
That was Josefina's reaction too.
There's just so much to unpack there. First of all, he's doing all of this just because he wants babies.
Apparently.
The man is unbalanced.
Delusional, more likely. It's crazy.
And that's what Josefina thought, because in that moment, she thought his plan was so delusional that there was no way Gary would actually follow through. She actually said, quote, "At first, I was relieved. Until then, I thought he wanted me dead. But hearing his plan was just unbelievable."
Let's throw the key away.
Just hold on a little bit.
I was about ready to swallow this key.
Herself, yeah.
She's like, I'll take it.
But unfortunately, Gary would remain true to his plan, and by January 1987, he had kidnapped another 4 women. He kidnapped Sandra Lindsay, age 24, on December 3rd, 1986, Lisa Thomas, age 19, on December 23rd, 1986, Deborah Dudley, age 23, on January 2nd, 1987, and Jacqueline Askins, age 18, on January 18th, 1987. He held all these women captive in a pit in the basement of his house at 3520 North Marshall Street in North Philadelphia. The captives were starved, raped, beaten, and tortured. Now, I want to say that Gary was white, but all of his kidnapping and murder victims were black.
If he wants them to have babies, why is he starving them?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
That does make no sense to me. I mean, women who are starving cannot get pregnant because they don't have enough energy. Their body's not going to keep a child. So I'm trying to understand his logic.
I mean, if women get too stressed, they'll stop having their period because their body is like, we can't have a child right now.
That's a good question. And honestly, I think it's because of his unbalanced mindset. I don't think he's being smart about it. As you will see later, when an unfortunate event happens, his response is not only disgusting, but I think it just goes to show you how mentally imbalanced he is and not thinking about this in a logical way if he actually wants to have more babies.
Even if a woman does get pregnant, it would be unlikely that they'd be able to carry the child to term. And even if that does happen, the birth without medical equipment and all this stuff, I can't imagine it would be successful.
So the reason I mentioned that Gary's white, but his murder victims were black, is because Gary's lawyer, when we get to that point, Charles Peruto, would eventually say that Gary was trying to enslave 10 girls to have a baby with all of them, and he was going to create a perfect race. He believed that the races, eventually, hundreds of years from now, would all be mixed and there would be only one race. And that's when we would find peace. He believed white people should mix with black people and vice versa, so we could get closer to a perfect race.
This is their defense?
I don't know if it's his defense. Honestly, I'm not really sure how people would take this in a trial. I don't know. Maybe it is his defense. It doesn't defend him kidnapping these women against their will.
I can't imagine them being like, well, we enslaved them, and people in the jury be like, you know what? I can't see it. Because in the quote, didn't he say like he enslaved them?
Yes, he did mention that he was enslaving them to create a perfect race. But of course, it's just problematic.
I just don't understand why the attorney thought this was something he needed to inform us. Yeah. Because Gary is a nobody, and no one asked Gary to create the perfect race. So I guess I'm missing the point of an attorney making a comment that makes no sense to me.
Yeah, Gary, no one asked you.
That's a perfect point.
Well, Gary didn't say it. His attorney said it.
Here's the thing. I think aspiring for a perfect race is problematic as a whole.
Well, it appears to me that the attorney didn't know what to say and came up with a completely stupid idea and made a comment on it. If you want to get up and say that to the media, what are you really saying?
I think, and what I'm about to tell you is, I think one of the reasons he included this is because he's trying to make Gary seem insane and unfit for prison so he can be sent to a mental institution or just get off on a lesser charge. So this would actually potentially help his defense, depending on how you want to argue it.
It seems like he knew what he was doing was wrong, though. I mean, he's hiding them.
It's a good point.
So, wow, we all want Gary to be the father of the perfect race.
Okay, let's get back into it. One of the women, 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay, unfortunately ended up dying on February 7, 1987, from a combination of starvation, torture, and an untreated fever after being suspended to the ceiling for 2 days by her wrists. Gary's reaction to her death shows just how disgusting he is. Thinking she was pregnant, when he realized she was dead, he said, "Oh man, what a waste of a baby."
Wow, not even dressing the woman that just died. So he just sees them as objects, basically, like sex objects.
Yes, in order to get his children. And it kind of goes to what you said is why, Mom, earlier, is why is he starving them if he wants them to have babies? It really doesn't make any sense. He's illogical. He's mentally imbalanced. So I just don't think he's being a logical individual at this point. Gary dismembered her body, but had problems dealing with the arms and legs, so he put them in a freezer and labeled them dog food. He cooked her ribs in an oven and boiled her head in a pot on the stove. Police officers came to his house after his neighbors complained that a nauseating odor was emanating from his residence. They ended up leaving, though, because Gary said that he had been cooking a roast and had fallen asleep and burnt it, and they just believed him.
It's kind of sounding like Dahmer.
It's reminding me of Omaima.
Oh, yeah, 'cause she did that too.
Yeah, she did this whole cooking up thing. Allegedly, Gary would end up grinding Sandra's flesh, mixing it with dog food, and feeding it to his other victims. However, his defense attorney, Chuck Peruto, said that upon examination of a Cuisinart and other tools in his kitchen, they found no evidence of this. Chuck said that Gary made up the story to support the insanity defense, and that Gary started the rumor of cannibalism in public and that there was no evidence of anyone eating human flesh. However, Josephina said that they thought they ate Sandra because they were forced to eat something that she said, quote, "There was this horrible, horrible smell I will never forget in my life. It was bad. This odor was consuming." So Josephina and the other woman think that they did eat Sandra just because they were given some kind of meat that smelled absolutely horrid.
Interesting. What do you think? Do you think that it was her?
I personally believe Josephina and the woman. I think if they're being fed their normal food and then all of a sudden after Sandra dies and he's been processing her body parts disgustingly, and then they're given this piece of meat that smells unusually bad. Don't forget he burnt it too. So I'm going to have to believe them.
I need the key and I'm going to throw it in the deepest parts of the ocean. This is the most disgusting thing I've heard.
It's just crazy. To do that to the woman, they're going through this trauma together. So after they saw one of the girls die, and on top of that, they're being forced to possibly eat the other one. It's just trauma beyond trauma.
And to think that they could be next.
Yeah. Did they ever find her body?
Yes.
First of all, if he was emotionally abused as a child, what he's doing is beyond normal. People have been emotionally abused and yeah, they become criminals, they do things, but just this sounds really, really bad. Furthermore, I don't know, this mental abuse thing, this is worse than mental abuse. I mean, this is just severe.
Psychological torture. Yeah.
This is beyond him having mental
Oh,
illness.
100%.
There's something else going on here.
In addition to just physically torture, he's psychologically torturing them too. Just with this idea of like giving them
To eat
right.
the other woman. This is
Unbelievable.
if he's going to sit there and claim that he was emotionally abused as a child, I don't see the severity of his childhood unless they don't know everything that happened to him. I mean, this is like more than having mental illness. There's something else going on here.
Honestly, who knows what the heck happened? Who knows if he was more genetically predispositioned to become like this, if he had some negative environments in his childhood, or who knows what really happened. Later on in this case, I will share a quote that his niece said, but she essentially says that the whole family was screwed up and really weird. And he did suffer physical abuse too, but who even knows to the extent of it what happened? And don't forget, Gary was a huge bedwetter as a child, and sometimes that can mean there's some sexual abuse going on. And not to say that because somebody experiences sexual abuse as a child that they're going to turn up like Gary, but if he has a certain genetic predisposition and then also experiences these effects in his childhood, it could set him on the wrong course for life.
Does bedwetting also represent sexual abuse or just having an emotional or physical abuse in the home too?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I've heard it stated more as sexual.
Well, I do know that there is some research that suggests that bedwetting can also be like any sort of disturbing event that they've had in their life. So it could be not just sexual abuse, it can be other abuse or just trauma or any sort of bad thing that happened could contribute to bedwetting.
Well, his whole childhood had trauma, so
Right.
that makes sense for him.
Mm-hmm.
And then if he's being punished for the bedwetting, it's just a vicious cycle.
Right.
I do want to say that Gary's supposed best friend, Cyril Brown, witnessed Sandra's death in the basement and saw Gary dismembering her body. If he was in the basement, I'm going to assume there's no way he could have missed the other woman being held captive there.
Yeah.
Was he also going to be a father of the human race, the perfect human race?
They never mentioned anything about being sexually abused by him, but who knows what was going on in his mind and Gary's mind.
Still, he saw a murder, and I'm assuming he didn't do anything.
And he saw other women who were being held captive and didn't try to help them.
Exactly.
Isn't he a culprit then?
He is, because not only did he not say anything about his friend murdering and dismembering a person, but he also, like I said, did not get any help for these women, which is just wrong. It's disappointing on so many levels. But if he had gotten help for the captive, at least one of their lives would have been saved, as we'll soon see.
His friend also have mental issues?
It's never mentioned or talked about, but in my opinion, there is something wrong with you if you see people being held against their will and you don't do something about it.
Does he have a criminal record that you know of?
They didn't mention it. In the articles that I found, they did not mention anything about it.
Okay.
Gary also used electric shock as a form of torture. Gary ordered Josephina and one of the other three to fill a hole in the basement with water. He then forced Lisa, Deborah, and Jacqueline, bound in chains, into a pit. Gary then made Josephina help him apply electric current from a stripped extension cord to the woman's chains. 23-year-old Deborah Dudley was horrifically electrocuted to death on March 19, 1987, and Gary disposed of her body in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. Gary also wrapped duct tape around the mouths of the victims and stabbed them in their ears with a screwdriver, which is just so horrific and awful. I can't imagine the pain they had to endure.
It sounds more like he wanted these women for torture than for the human race.
Yeah.
Idea.
It surely does. Because he is not keeping the mothers healthy and safe if he wants to be having healthy babies. On March 23rd, 1987, Gary and Josephina abducted 24-year-old Agnes Adams. The next day, Josephina convinced Gary to let her go, temporarily, so she could visit her family. But Josephina has other plans. Josephina said she realized that the reason Gary wanted all those babies was because he was lonely, so she decided to use this knowledge to her advantage and pretend that she was on his side, which is how he eventually trusted her enough to let her leave. So Gary drove Josephina to a gas station and said that he would wait for her there. She walked to her boyfriend's house. She initially wanted to confront Gary, but then decided to call the police instead. The responding officers, noting chafing from chains on her legs, went to the gas station and detained Gary. At this point, Gary's best friend, Sarah Brown, was also arrested. Sarah was released on $50,000 bail and an agreement that he would testify against Gary. Cyril admitted that he had witnessed Sandra's death in the basement and that he had witnessed Gary dismembering her body. Shortly after his arrest in April 1987, Gary attempted to hang himself in his jail cell. So at this point, Josephina, Lisa, Jacqueline, and Agnes are the remaining victims who ended up surviving.
How long did he have these women captive for now at the moment?
So 5 months. So because he abducted Josephina in November of 1986, and in April of 1987, he was arrested. Gary would refuse to take any responsibility and would create all sorts of defenses in order to try and get out of facing any sort of punishment. At his arraignment, Gary claimed that the women were already in the house when he moved in, which is just ridiculous.
I know where I know the story from.
Where?
If any of you guys have not watched this, I highly, highly, highly recommend you do. It's called I Survived a Serial Killer. I think I told you guys about this a while ago when I was watching it because I was like, oh my God, it's such an interesting story.
I can't believe there's that many men and women who've survived serial killers that they can make a show about that.
Yeah, there's 16 episodes. There's one season and 16 episodes. She was the last episode. And it's Josefina Rivera comes on and she talks about it. And that's where I knew it from. That's where I was like, I don't remember because I thought it was this show, but I wanted to double check. And yes, so if you haven't watched it, I Survived a Serial Killer. I think it's on Hulu. And it's crazy hearing their stories and how they've survived. And it's men and women. They both talk about all these. It's incredible. It's really sad, but you still get to have a little bit of hope that some people survived and just to tell their story, and it's really brave.
Definitely have to look into that.
Yeah. I'm shocked you didn't see the episode.
I just think it's crazy that he would say that these women were already in the house when he moved in. And also, you're going to tell me you show up to a house and find women chained in the basement, and you think that you supposedly keeping them there in that condition is supposed to help your defense? Again, Chuck Peruto has quite an interesting defense strategy, I will say. But he has not been given the best. At trial, like I mentioned, Gary was defended by Charles Peruto Jr., who attempted to prove that Gary was legally insane. Gary's insanity claim was successfully rebutted by the prosecution, led by Charles Gallagher III. The fact that Gary had successfully amassed approximately $550,000 through his brokerage account was used to prove that he was an astute investor and therefore not insane. Testimony, which was given by his Merrill Lynch financial advisor, Robert Kirkpatrick, was also used to prove Gary's mental competence. Robert Kirkpatrick called Gary an astute investor who knew exactly what he was doing. On July 1st, 1988, Gary was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. At his trial, Gary refused to ever admit guilt, stating, quote, "I say real or phony, they can execute me because I am innocent and I can prove it. That is the end of capital punishment in this state. When you execute an innocent man, knowingly execute an innocent man, you know there will be no more capital punishment in this state and possibly anywhere else in this country. And you know I didn't kill them 2 women. Go ahead and execute me. Yes, I want you to execute an innocent man so there will be no more capital punishment." End quote. Clearly, Gary was just a very sick, twisted, and disturbed man. He was sentenced to death and incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Pittsburgh. In January 1989, he attempted suicide with an overdose of prescribed Thorazine, but failed. In 1997, Gary's daughter, Maxine Davidson White, and his ex-wife, Betty, filed a suit in federal court in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in which they requested a stay of execution on the basis that Gary was not competent enough to be executed. After 2 years of legal proceedings in various courts, on July 3, 1999, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania issued its final ruling clearing the way for Gary's execution. Governor of Pennsylvania Tom Ridge, who had campaigned on a pledge to accelerate the signing of death warrants, which were delayed under former Governor Bob Casey Sr., said Gary's execution was justified. Gary's daughter, Maxine, spent an hour with him before his execution, but left before he was actually executed. Maxine's attorney, Kathy Swedlow, told the Post-Gazette that Maxine was devastated. She said, quote, "The state has executed an extremely mentally ill and psychotic man," end quote. I just want to say that, personally, Gary was definitely mentally ill. He was diagnosed with personality disorder, and I'm sure, and there was definitely more going on because he was horrifically torturing all these women, but I'm not sure he was psychotic because at the very least, he wasn't diagnosed with psychosis. So I don't know if he was psychotic or not, but he wasn't diagnosed. He definitely seemed to be aware of what he was doing. So at the end of the day, I think he knew what he was doing was wrong and was aware of his actions, and it never seemed as though he felt any sorrow or guilt or empathy at all for what he did and for his victims, or at least he never showed it.
I mean, yeah, he was still pretending that he was innocent till his death.
He was trying to make it that he was innocent. He tried all sorts of defenses.
And he knew it, but I don't know. It's just crazy that people with so much evidence would still be like, "I didn't do it."
I know. Gary's last meal was 2 slices of cheese pizza and black coffee. He was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999, at the State Correctional Institution, Rockview, in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and his body was cremated. He was the last person executed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and remains the third of only 3 people executed there since the resumption of the death penalty. The other 2 were Keith Zettelmoyer in May 1995 and Leon Moser in August 1995. Keith Zettelmoyer was on death row for murdering his friend, who was set to testify against him in a burglary case, and Leon was on death row for killing his ex-wife and his 2 daughters. Jacqueline attended Gary's execution, as did Sandra's family and Deborah's family. Sandra said, "I went to the execution, but it was too calm and serene for me. I'm thinking execution is something like, turn around and let me shoot you. Instead, they just stuck a needle in his arm. He never looked at us, never acknowledged us, never said he was sorry. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look in our direction." Which I'm just saddened to hear that it wasn't what Sandra's sister hoped it would be. But Sandra's sister wasn't the only one dissatisfied with the execution. Jacqueline said, "I watched him die. It didn't bring no satisfaction." Josephina chose not to attend and said it would have been better for him to sit in a 4x4 cell. Gary's brutal crimes, for better or worse, supposedly inspired the character of serial killer Buffalo Bill in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. When it comes to Gary's family today, Maxine has managed to stay under the radar. She once attended Temple University, but we haven't heard anything about her since. Gary's niece, Shannon Heidnik, which I told you about before, this is what she said about the family. Quote, "The whole family was screwed up and weird. My mom told me how their dad beat Gary real bad with a toy wooden airplane because he peed his pants. His dad was an alcoholic and his mom took poison. They found her in the basement. She was tired of the abuse. They were really sick parents and they gave their kids some serious problems. Gary and my dad left Ohio at some point, and I'm not exactly sure how we wound up in Pennsylvania." End quote. While Gary is no longer here, his victims are still left to deal with the repercussions of what happened to them that night. Reflecting on all of this decades later, Josephina, the first victim he took, said, "I wish I hadn't gone out that night. I wanted to get clean for the sake of my kids. I had 3 kids, and though the 2 youngest were in temporary foster care, the judge said if I stayed off drugs, I may get them back." Josephina says that today, even seeing certain objects like a screwdriver can trigger her from her captivity and send her into a depressive episode that lasts a month. I'm not surprised, just knowing how a screwdriver was used for them before. After Gary's arrest, Josephina still had an ordeal to go through because some people, including the press and some of the survivors, thought she was an accomplice and they wanted her charged. Because Josephina held the extension cord with Gary and was part of electrocuting the other woman, where Deborah ultimately died, the other victims assumed she was in on it and are really bothered by what she did. They actually wanted to have charges pressed against her. I can see why people, especially the surviving women, are disturbed by what happened, and ultimately the survivors are the ones who can only say they were there and experienced it firsthand. But I do want to say that Josephina was a victim too, and I personally believe she was just trying to do whatever it took to survive. And ultimately, her pretending to be an accomplice to Gary is what allowed him to trust her into giving her the freedom to walk off, which is ultimately what also ended up saving her and the other woman. And we'll get into it later, but one of the survivors ends up acknowledging this later on and does say that Josephina doing what she did is what set them free. And if we remember, Josephina was there for 5 months. So considering some people have people locked up for years, which is just so sad to think about, it seems like Josephina, when she had the opportunity, took it to escape and help the others.
These women were missing for 5 months. Were the police not looking for them?
But don't forget, they were leading what they would deem as high-risk lifestyles, because I think most of them, if not all of them, were prostitutes. So, when, unfortunately, they went missing, I don't know for sure, but I know lots of times police don't give prostitutes the same time and value as they would give other victims.
The police did not do their due diligence with searching for these women, right?
There's no mention of the police knew these women were missing or they didn't care or anything. There was no mention. I'm not even really sure the police knew these women were missing or had made any connections.
It just doesn't sound right because it's, 6 women? Someone would have noticed. I know they were leading lives that maybe it's difficult to trace or know what they're doing, but I mean, the same thing happened in New York where all these women were missing and eventually they finally put it together. But it just sounds like no one was looking for them.
I don't know. Nothing about that is even mentioned, and it could be no one was looking for them. Josephina had to give up her 2 youngest children for adoption when she came out of the cellar because she wasn't capable of caring for them. And she did pick up her drug habit again for a number of years to cope with the ongoing trauma. She also returned to sex work for a year after the trial, but eventually gave up both prostitution and drugs for good. She has since worked different jobs as a waitress, security guard, and daycare worker. She said, quote, "My time in the cellar changed me forever. I kept trying to go back to the person I was before Heidnik, but it simply wasn't possible." End quote. Josephina finally found the right therapy around 2010, and she was reunited with the children she gave up for adoption. She is now a grandmother of 6 and close to all her family, and she has found peace at last living near the sea in Atlantic City and collecting sea glass. She even married her long-term partner, Chris Lyle. Josefina is still in counseling and experiences panic attacks, but they are less frequent. However, she still has to turn off the TV if she sees chains or handcuffs. Ultimately, though, Josefina is proud of her strength and how far she's come in battling her trauma. Some final words from Josefina I want to share are, quote, "You don't ever totally get over an experience like mine. You just have to learn to live with it. It is a constant struggle to deal with normal life, but being by the sea has helped. There I am free and safe. For a long time, I was haunted by Gary, by the woman who died next to me, but not any longer. I hope I can inspire other victims to feel positive about the future." End quote. All the survivors received a $30,000 settlement. Lisa and Agnes were never really able to recover from the experience and have dealt with mental health issues and addiction in the years since. Jacqueline still lives in Philadelphia and cleans houses. She's close with her 2 sons, who are now adults, and is on medication to deal with her anxiety and trauma. She does suffer from intense flashbacks and still can't enter any basement. Jacqueline and Josefina did end up having a meeting that was shown in Monster Preacher, and it was a tense and emotional reunion. Jacqueline said to Josefina, quote, "I ain't gonna lie, I did have some hate for you. I blamed you for a lot of stuff that happened down there." End quote. But after Josefina explained her position, Jacqueline was able to understand her better. Jacqueline said to her, quote, "I think the plan you did was the best one. We're here." End quote. The two parted on a hopeful note, believing the reunion was essential for both of them to heal.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, it's horrible that that's how people felt towards Josefina, but I'm just glad that people realized that she was a victim too, and that it was the only way that they were ever going to get out, because it's clear that no one was really looking for them.
I can totally understand why people, especially Jacqueline, would be disturbed by Josefina a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised when these women were finally found. It doesn't sound like there wasn't any help or assistance set up for them. I mean, not only do they need therapists, they need medical assistance, they need assistance for jobs. I mean, they've been out. Their whole life has changed. It's just kind of like they were saved and there they go. Bye.
That's a really good point. There should be some sort of system where if somebody goes through something traumatic like this, like a kidnapping, that they are given the resources to get back on their feet.
I mean, they were given $30,000. That's nothing. You can't even pay for therapy at $30,000. So
yeah.
I just don't understand. I mean, they were just kind of like, "Oh, we saved you. Goodbye. Go back to your normal life." There's no such thing as normal life after this.
I wonder if there's a foundation that helps victims who have survived these sorts of situations. I'm hoping and assuming there is, but I'm not sure. And I'm not sure to the extent that it can help all the survivors.
Maybe now, but back then, probably not.
You're right. A lot has changed over the years.
I'm just glad that they got out. I know they won't ever be the same, but at least they're not there.
True. I'm really sad that they had to go through all of this and have to live with the traumas of it, but I'm happy that at least some of them were able to get out. It's really sad for Sandra and Deborah's family, though, that they lost their loved ones, and not only lost them, but lost them in horrific ways.
It's just really unfortunate.
Oh, well, this is the ending. I want to thank you for listening to us this week. We love our listeners, and because of you, we do this podcast. Your help and engagement really helps the podcast grow. So if you enjoyed this episode, please text it to a friend and family member to give our podcast a listen. Until next time, make sure you stay on the airy side. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Be safe.